I never thought my own daughter would leave me stranded in the middle of nowhere like I was yesterday's trash, but there I was, 63 years old, standing on a cracked platform at some godforsaken train station in rural France, watching their rental car disappear into the fog. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world right now, drop a comment and let me know where you are, because I need to know I'm not alone in this. And if you've ever felt abandoned by the people you loved most, you're going to want to hear every word of what I'm about to tell you. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and check the description box below for more stories like this one, because what happened next changed everything. The argument had started small, like they always do. We were supposed to be on this dream vacation together. Melanie, her husband Brad, and me. 3 weeks touring Europe. It was supposed to be healing. Melanie and I had been distant for years, ever since her father died, and I thought maybe this trip would bring us back together. I'd saved for 2 years to afford my portion. 2 years of skipping dinners out, of patching clothes instead of buying new ones, of saying no to everything except this one hope that maybe my daughter still loved me enough to want me around. But Brad had other ideas. From the moment we landed in Paris, I could feel his resentment. Every restaurant I suggested was too expensive or too touristy. Every museum I wanted to visit was boring. When I asked to sit down because my hip was bothering me, he'd sigh loudly and exchange looks with Melanie like I was some burden they'd been saddled with against their will. And Melanie, God, my Melanie, she just went along with it. Every single time. She'd become a stranger to me, this woman who used to be my little girl, who used to crawl into my lap when she had nightmares and tell me I was her whole world. The final straw came on our 8th day, in that tiny train station in Burgundy. We'd been arguing about the itinerary. I wanted to visit a small art gallery I'd read about, something quiet and meaningful. Brad wanted to drive straight through to the Swiss Alps because he'd promised his Instagram followers mountain content. When I insisted, just once, that maybe we could compromise, he exploded. Called me selfish. Said I'd been dragging them down the entire trip. Said I was the reason they couldn't enjoy their vacation. And Melanie, my daughter, my only child, she didn't defend me. She just stood there, arms crossed, nodding along like he was making perfect sense. Like I was the problem. Like everything he said was justified. That's when I made my mistake. I told them exactly what I thought of Brad. Told him he was a controlling, manipulative man who'd turned my daughter into someone I didn't recognize. Told Melanie she'd betrayed everything I'd taught her about standing up for yourself. The words came out hot and sharp, fueled by 8 days of swallowed insults and a lifetime of watching my daughter choose everyone else over me. Brad's face went purple. He grabbed Melanie's arm and said, "We're leaving. Now." And Melanie, God, I'll never forget the look on her face. She hesitated for maybe 3 seconds. 3 seconds where I thought she might actually choose me. Then she turned and started walking toward the car. I called after her. Told her to wait, that we could talk about this. But Brad was already at the driver's side, engine starting. I thought they'd stop. I thought even Brad wouldn't actually drive away and leave his mother-in-law alone at a train station where I didn't speak the language, didn't know where I was, didn't even have a working phone because I'd been relying on their international plan. But he did. And she let him. The last thing I heard was Brad's voice through the open window, loud enough for me to catch every word. She'll be begging us to pick her up within the hour. And Melanie, my daughter, she actually laughed. Not a big laugh, not a cruel one, but a laugh nonetheless. A small, dismissive sound that told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in her life now. Then they were gone. Taillights disappearing into the mist. And I was alone. The platform was empty except for me and my small rolling suitcase. It was mid-afternoon, but the sky was gray and heavy with rain. The station was barely a station at all, just a covered platform with a broken bench and a faded schedule I couldn't read. No attendant. No other travelers. Just me and the sound of wind moving through the vineyard fields that stretched out in every direction. I stood there for a long time, waiting for the panic to hit. Waiting to feel that crushing fear that would make me pull out my dead phone and beg someone, anyone, for help. That's what Brad expected. That's what they were both counting on, that I'd be so terrified, so helpless, that I'd have no choice but to call them sobbing and apologize for everything, even though I'd done nothing wrong. But the panic never came. Instead, something else settled over me. Something quiet and cold and remarkably clear. I looked down at my suitcase, then at the schedule board, then at the empty road where their car had disappeared. And I thought, no. Not this time. I'd spent 37 years married to a man who made me feel small. 5 years since he died, trying to rebuild a relationship with a daughter who clearly didn't want one. I'd apologized for things that weren't my fault, bent myself into shapes that didn't fit, smiled through insults and stayed quiet when I should have screamed. All of it in the name of keeping peace. All of it hoping that if I just tried hard enough, loved hard enough, I'd be enough. Standing on that platform, I realized I was done. Done begging. Done apologizing. Done making myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. I picked up my suitcase and started walking. There was a small village about half a mile down the road. I could see a church spire rising above the trees. My hip protested with every step, but I kept going. When I reached the village, I found a cafe with Wi-Fi. The owner, a woman about my age with kind eyes and wrinkled hands, took one look at my face and brought me tea without asking. I logged into my email on her computer and checked my bank account. I had money. Not a fortune, but enough. More than enough, actually, because I'd saved aggressively for this trip, budgeting for emergencies and extras I'd never gotten to use because Brad controlled everything. I opened a new tab and searched for trains out of the nearest major station. Then hostels. Then small hotels. Then I did something I hadn't done in decades. I asked myself what I actually wanted. Not what Melanie wanted. Not what Brad wanted. Not what any dead husband or distant friend or societal expectation wanted. Just me. What did I want? The answer came swift and certain. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to go somewhere they'd never think to look. Somewhere I could breathe without feeling their judgment pressing down on me. Somewhere I could remember who I used to be before I became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's burden. I stayed in that cafe for 3 hours, planning. The owner kept refilling my tea and never once asked me to leave, even though I could tell the dinner rush was about to start. When I finally stood up to go, I pressed €50 into her hand, probably too much, but she'd given me something more valuable than tea. She'd given me space to think. That night, I stayed in a small inn in the village. I didn't call Melanie. Didn't send a text. Didn't reach out at all. And you know what? My phone never rang. Not once. They weren't worried about me. They were waiting for me to break. But I didn't break. I rebuilt. The next morning, I took a train south. And then another. And another. I watched France slide past my window, then Italy, then the Adriatic coast. I was chasing something I couldn't name yet, some pull I felt in my chest that said keep going, you're not there yet, keep moving. If you've ever felt that pull, that deep knowing that you need to leave everything behind to find yourself again, you understand. And if you don't, stick with me, because this is where the story really begins. Make sure you're subscribed, because what I'm about to tell you next, about what I found when I finally stopped running, it's something I never could have predicted. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't go back. 3 weeks after they left me on that platform, I found myself in Greece. Not the Greece you see in travel magazines. Not Santorini with its whitewashed buildings and cruise ship crowds. I ended up in a small coastal village called Parga, tucked into the northwestern coast where the mountains meet the Ionian Sea. I chose it because it was cheap, because the photos online showed quiet beaches and narrow streets, and because it was the kind of place where an American woman traveling alone could disappear without anyone asking questions. I'd been moving constantly since France, sleeping in hostels, taking overnight trains, eating bread and cheese from corner stores to stretch my money. But something about Parga made me stop. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the way the light hit the water in the early morning, turning it colors I didn't have names for. Or maybe it was just that I'd finally run far enough that I couldn't feel Brad's contempt or Melanie's rejection chasing me anymore. I rented a small studio apartment for a month. It cost less than my phone bill back home. The place was barely furnished, a bed, a table, a tiny kitchen with a 2-burner stove, but it had a balcony that overlooked the water, and every morning I'd sit there with coffee and watch the fishing boats head out while the village slowly woke up around me. For the first week, I barely spoke to anyone. I'd walk to the market for groceries, smile politely at the shopkeepers, and retreat back to my apartment like a wounded animal returning to its den. I wasn't ready yet to be a person again. I was still too angry, too raw, too afraid that if I opened my mouth the only thing that would come out would be screaming. But slowly, the village worked its way into me. The woman who ran the produce stand started setting aside the good tomatoes when she saw me coming. The old men playing backgammon in the square would nod at me as I passed. The baker's son, who spoke broken English, started leaving fresh bread outside my door every morning with a note that just said welcome. I started to breathe differently. Started to sleep through the night without waking up angry. Started to remember things about myself I'd forgotten. Like how I used to paint before I got married, how I used to love reading poetry, how I used to be someone who laughed easily and often before life taught me that joy was something you had to earn through suffering. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into my stay, I was sitting at a beachside cafe when a woman around my age sat down at the next table. She was Greek, silver-haired and sun-weathered, with the kind of face that made you want to tell her your whole life story. She ordered wine and stared at the water with the same expression I'd been wearing for days. Like she was looking for something she'd lost a long time ago. We caught each other's eyes, and she smiled. "American?" she asked. "That obvious?" I replied. "The shoes," she said, gesturing to my sensible walking sneakers. "Europeans would never." We both laughed, and just like that we were talking. Her name was Eleni, and she'd lived in this village her whole life except for 10 years in Athens that she described as a beautiful mistake. She'd come back after her divorce to help her sister run a small guest house. She asked what brought me to Parga, and I surprised myself by telling her the truth. All of it. The trip, the argument, the abandonment, the weeks of running. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. She just nodded and said, "Good. They freed you. Now what are you going to do with it?" That question lodged itself in my chest like a seed. What was I going to do with it? Eleni invited me to dinner at her sister's guest house that night. I met Sophia, the sister, who was louder and rounder than Eleni but just as warm. They fed me food I couldn't pronounce and wine that tasted like sunshine, and they introduced me to their circle, a rotating cast of locals and long-term travelers who gathered there most evenings. There was Thomas, a retired German architect who'd been in Parga for 6 years and claimed he'd only meant to stay a week. There was Ava, a young British woman who was teaching English at the local school. There was Dimitri, who owned the bakery and whose son had been leaving me bread. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Not because I'd earned it or because I'd made myself small enough to fit, but just because I'd shown up and been myself. They asked about my life, and I told them stories I hadn't thought about in years. About teaching art at a community college before Melanie was born, about the pottery studio I'd dreamed of opening, about the trip to Morocco I'd planned with friends that never happened because my husband said it was too dangerous and I believed him. "Why don't you paint here?" Sophia asked, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I don't have supplies," I said. The next morning, there was a box outside my door. Watercolors, brushes, paper. Not expensive but real. A note from Sophia that said, "No more excuses." So I painted. I sat on my balcony every morning and painted the water, the boats, the way the light changed from rose to gold to harsh white as the sun climbed higher. I was terrible at first. My hands had forgotten how to translate what my eyes saw. But slowly, something came back to me. Not skill exactly, but joy. The pure, uncomplicated pleasure of creating something for no reason except that I wanted to. I started taking my paintings to the cafe where I'd met Eleni. She'd critique them brutally and honestly, which I loved because it meant she took me seriously. Other people would stop to look. A few asked if I'd sell them. I said no at first, because they weren't good enough, because I was embarrassed. But Eleni pushed me to say yes, and when I finally sold my first painting to a tourist for €40, I cried. Not because of the money, but because someone had seen something I made and wanted to keep it. The weeks accumulated like watercolor layers. I fell into rhythms. Morning painting. Afternoon walks along the coastal path. Evenings with Eleni and Sophia and whoever else showed up. I started helping out at the guest house sometimes, just for something to do, making beds, serving breakfast, talking to guests. Sophia offered to pay me, but I refused because it felt too much like a transaction. This wasn't work. This was life. I stopped checking my phone obsessively. I'd set up a new SIM card early on, had sent one text to Melanie saying I was fine and not to worry, and then nothing. She never responded. Never called. Never asked where I was or if I was okay. The silence was its own kind of answer, and after the initial sting faded, I found it almost liberating. She'd made her choice. Now I was making mine. If you've ever had to choose yourself after a lifetime of choosing everyone else, you know how terrifying and necessary that moment is. Drop a comment if you've been there, because I promise you're not alone. And make sure you check the description box for more stories about finding yourself after loss, because that's exactly what this was. I was finding myself. The self that existed before I became someone's everything and ended up being no one's anything. By the 5th week, I'd sold enough paintings to cover my rent. Started thinking maybe I could stay longer than a month. Maybe I could stay indefinitely. The visa situation was complicated, but Eleni thought she could help me figure it out. Maybe I could teach art classes to tourists. Maybe I could help run the guest house. Maybe I could just exist here, in this small beautiful place, and that could be enough. I was painting on my balcony one morning, working on a piece of the harbor at dawn, when I heard voices in the street below. American voices. Familiar voices. My hands went still. Brush hovering over paper. Heart suddenly loud in my ears. I looked down and saw them, Melanie and Brad, walking up the narrow street toward my building. Looking tired and frustrated and completely out of place in their expensive travel clothes and their matching designer sunglasses. I watched them stop at the building entrance. Watched Brad pull out his phone and check something. Watched Melanie look up at the windows, searching. They'd found me. I didn't move from the balcony. Part of me couldn't believe they were really there, that after 6 weeks of silence, they'd somehow tracked me down to this tiny village on the edge of Greece. Another part of me had always known this moment would come, that the distance and the peace I'd built were temporary, that eventually I'd have to face what I'd left behind. But I wasn't the same woman they'd abandoned in France. That woman would have hidden. Would have felt guilty for making them worry, for causing trouble, for being difficult. That woman would have rushed downstairs apologizing before they even knocked. I stayed exactly where I was and kept painting. The knock came 3 minutes later. Loud, insistent, Brad's knock. I could picture him down there, jaw tight with irritation that I hadn't immediately responded. I let him knock twice more before I set down my brush, walked slowly through my apartment, and opened the door. Melanie's face was a complicated mix of relief and anger. Brad's was just anger. They were sunburned and dusty from traveling, and I could tell from their expressions that they'd been searching for a while. Good. Mom, Melanie started, voice tight with emotion I couldn't quite read. We've been looking everywhere for you. I texted you that I was fine, I said calmly. Week 1. You never responded. You disappeared, Brad cut in, voice sharp. Do you have any idea what you put us through? We had to file a missing persons report. We had to contact the embassy. We've spent weeks trying to track you down. I leaned against the doorframe and studied them both. Melanie looked thinner than she had in France, dark circles under her eyes. Brad looked the same, sharp-featured and impatient, like the world was constantly failing to meet his expectations. I'm not missing, I said. I'm right here. Now, what do you want? The question seemed to throw them. Like they'd expected tears and gratitude and immediate capitulation. Like they'd expected the old me. We want you to come home, Melanie said, but her voice faltered on the word home, like she wasn't quite sure what that meant anymore. Why? What do you mean, why? Brad's voice was rising now. Because you're her mother. Because you can't just run away when things get difficult. I didn't run away, I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice was. You abandoned me. There's a difference. We were angry, Melanie said quickly, like she'd been practicing this. We both said things we didn't mean. But Mom, you can't do this. This isn't like you. Maybe you don't know what I'm like anymore, I said. Maybe I don't either. But I'm starting to figure it out. I saw her flinch at that, saw something crack in her carefully composed expression. For a moment, I thought she might actually be listening. Might actually be seeing me as something other than an obligation or a problem to solve. But then Brad put his hand on her shoulder, possessive, controlling, and said, "We didn't come here to argue. We came to bring you back. We've already talked to a travel agent about changing your flight. We can leave tomorrow." The assumption in his voice, that I would just comply, that all he had to do was tell me what was happening and I'd follow, made something hot and bright flare up in my chest. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "Mom," Melanie started. "I'm not going anywhere," I repeated, louder this time. "I'm staying here. I have an apartment. I have friends. I'm painting again. I'm happy. For the first time in years, I'm actually happy. So no, Brad, I won't be getting on a plane tomorrow or any other day just because you decided it's time for me to stop being an inconvenience." Brad's face went red. "You're being ridiculous. What are you going to do, live in Greece forever? You don't speak the language. You don't have a visa. You're 63 years old." "I'm aware of my age," I cut him off. "And I'm aware that you think it makes me helpless. But I've managed just fine without you. Better than fine, actually." "This is insane," he said, turning to Melanie like she should be agreeing with him. "Tell her this is insane." But Melanie wasn't looking at him. She was looking at me, really looking at me, maybe for the first time since we'd started this trip. I watched her eyes move from my face to the open door behind me, where my apartment was visible, the easel by the window, the paintings propped against the wall, the small simple space I'd made mine. "You're really staying?" she asked, voice small. "I'm really staying," I said. Something shifted in her expression then. Pain, maybe. Or regret. Or the slow dawning realization that she'd broken something between us that couldn't be easily fixed. If you've ever watched someone you love realize they've hurt you beyond repair, you know how that moment feels, how it's terrible and necessary all at once. "Fine," Brad said sharply. "Stay. But don't expect us to keep checking on you. Don't expect us to bail you out when this whole fantasy falls apart and you can't pay rent or get home or whatever crisis inevitably happens. You want to be independent? Be independent. You're on your own." He turned and started walking away, clearly expecting Melanie to follow. She hesitated, torn between me and him, just like she'd been torn that day in France. But this time, something was different. This time, I could see her struggling with it, could see that the choice wasn't as automatic as it had been. "Go," I said quietly. "It's okay. I'm okay." She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something. Apology, maybe, or explanation, or just goodbye, but nothing came out. Finally, she turned and followed Brad down the stairs. I watched them walk away through the narrow street, his arm around her shoulders in a way that looked more like constraint than comfort. I went back to my balcony and picked up my brush. My hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline still fizzing through my system, but I kept painting. Made myself focus on the colors, the light, the way the water moved. Made myself stay in this life I'd built instead of spiraling into guilt or doubt about the life I'd left behind. An hour later, Eleni showed up at my door with wine and bread and Sophia trailing behind her with cheese and olives. "The whole village is talking," Eleni said without preamble. "Your daughter and the terrible husband. You sent them away." "I sent them away," I confirmed. Sophia pulled me into a fierce hug. "Good," she said. "You stay here. You paint. You be happy. Family is who loves you, not who you're born to." We sat on my balcony and ate and drank wine and watched the sun set over the water. They didn't ask me if I was okay or if I regretted anything or if I wanted to talk about my feelings. They just sat with me, present and solid and real, while I processed what had just happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the confrontation in my head, examining it from every angle. Part of me felt guilty. Melanie was my daughter, my only child, and I'd just sent her away. Part of me felt liberated. I'd stood up to Brad, had refused to let him control me, had chosen myself. And part of me just felt sad, grieving for the relationship with my daughter that I'd hoped this trip would fix, but that seemed more broken than ever. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and went out to my balcony with tea. The village was quiet except for the sound of water and the occasional bark of a distant dog. I sat there in the dark and thought about all the choices that had led me to this moment. Marrying young, subsuming myself in wifehood and motherhood, losing pieces of myself so gradually I didn't even notice until there was almost nothing left. And I thought about the choices I was making now. To stay. To paint. To build a life in this strange place with people I barely knew but who seemed to see me more clearly than my own family did. It felt terrifying and right in equal measure. The next morning, I woke up to find a note slipped under my door. Melanie's handwriting. It just said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this. But I'm sorry." No return address. No phone number. Just those words on a torn piece of hotel stationery. I held that note for a long time, crying quietly in my small apartment. Because it was something. Not enough, but something. An acknowledgement that what happened in France was wrong. That abandoning me was wrong. That somewhere under Brad's influence, my daughter still existed. But I didn't call her. Didn't chase her. Didn't try to fix it for her. Because that was the old pattern, and I was building new ones now. I taped the note to my mirror where I'd see it every morning, a reminder of what I'd lost and what I'd gained. Then I went to my balcony and started a new painting. 3 months after Melanie and Brad showed up in Parga, I signed a year-long lease on my apartment. The visa situation was complicated. Eleni had a cousin who knew someone, and there were forms and fees and bureaucratic gymnastics that I never fully understood, but somehow it worked out. Maybe it was meant to work out. Maybe the universe was finally paying me back for all those years of putting everyone else first. Or maybe I just got lucky. Either way, I was staying. The painting thing turned into something real. Not professional exactly, but real. Sophia convinced me to hang some pieces in the guest house, and they started selling regularly to tourists. A small gallery in town agreed to display a few on consignment. I wasn't making a fortune, but I was making enough to live on, which felt like its own kind of miracle. Every painting I sold was proof that I had value beyond being someone's wife or mother or burden. I started teaching small watercolor workshops once a week at the guest house. Just tourists mostly, people passing through who wanted to capture something of Greece to take home with them. But occasionally locals came too, young people curious about art, older people looking for something to do with their time. I discovered I was a better teacher than I'd remembered being. Patient. Encouraging. Able to help people see what they were trying to create and find the path to get there. The community I'd stumbled into that first month became something deeper. Eleni and Sophia treated me like family, the real kind, not the obligatory kind. Thomas started bringing me coffee every morning and staying to talk about philosophy and art and how strange it was to find home in a place you weren't born to. Ava invited me to help with her English classes, where I ended up teaching the local kids about American art and culture. Dimitri kept bringing me bread and refusing payment, saying I was good for the village and good for business. I was useful here. Not in the way I'd been useful before. Cooking meals no one thanked me for, organizing schedules no one appreciated, making myself small so others could expand, but useful in a way that felt reciprocal. I gave and received in equal measure. No one kept score. No one made me feel like I owed them for existing. My body changed. I lost weight without trying because I was walking everywhere, swimming in the sea most mornings, eating simple food that actually tasted like food instead of eating my feelings. My hip stopped hurting so much. Or maybe I just stopped noticing the pain because I was too busy paying attention to everything else. The light, the water, the way the village smelled different in different seasons. I made new friends among the long-term travelers and expats scattered throughout the region. We'd meet up for dinners that lasted 4 hours, talking about the lives we'd left behind and the lives we were building. Most of them had stories not that different from mine. Divorce, loss, jobs that consumed them, families that didn't understand them. We were all refugees from something, seeking asylum in beauty and simplicity. I thought about Melanie often. Wondered where she was, how she was doing, whether she was happy. Whether Brad was still controlling every aspect of her life or whether that confrontation in Greece had planted some seed of doubt in her. I wanted to call her sometimes, especially late at night when the loneliness got loud. But I never did. Because I knew if I called first, if I reached out first, we'd just fall back into the old pattern. I'd be apologizing for existing. She'd be forgiving me for crimes I didn't commit. And nothing would change. So I waited. And I painted. And I built this life that was entirely mine. About 4 months in, something unexpected happened. I fell in love. Not with a person, I was done with that particular complication, but with the village itself. With the rhythm of days that didn't require productivity or achievement. With the way people said good morning to each other like they meant it. With the sound of church bells in the evening and the way the old women sat outside their houses snapping beans and gossiping in Greek. With the sheer impossible beauty of waking up every morning to mountains and water and light that made everything look painted. I fell in love with the version of myself I was becoming. The woman who said no when she meant no. Who took up space without apologizing. Who created things just because she wanted to. Who laughed easily and often and wasn't afraid of taking up too much room or being too loud or wanting too much. This was who I'd been before, I realized. Before marriage and motherhood and loss convinced me I needed to shrink. This was the girl who'd wanted to travel the world and paint and teach and connect with people. Somehow, against all odds, she'd survived inside me. Just needed the right circumstances to emerge. Around month 5, I got an email from Melanie. Just a few lines, I think about you all the time. I don't know how to fix what's broken between us. But I want you to know I see it now. I see what Brad does. I see what I let happen. I'm working on it. I hope you're okay. I hope you're happy. I read that email probably 50 times. Cried over it. Felt hope flutter in my chest like something dangerous and necessary. But I didn't respond right away. I needed to think about what I wanted to say, what I was willing to offer, what boundaries needed to exist for us to have any kind of relationship moving forward. A week later, I wrote back, I am happy. Happier than I've been in years. I love you, and I'm proud of you for seeing what you're seeing. But I need you to know that I'm building a life here now, and I can't give it up. If you want to be part of my life, you'll have to accept that this is where I am. And I need you to come alone next time. No Brad. Just you and me, trying to figure out how to be family again. She responded within hours, okay. I'd like that. Can I visit in the spring? We made plans. Tentative, careful plans. She'd come for 2 weeks in April. Just her. We'd take it slow, try to rebuild from the ground up, see if there was still a relationship worth salvaging underneath all the hurt. I was terrified and hopeful in equal measure. But I was also clear about one thing, I wouldn't sacrifice this life I'd built to make her comfortable. Wouldn't apologize for choosing myself. Wouldn't shrink back into the mother-shaped box she'd kept me in for years. If we were going to have a relationship, it would have to be between 2 full people, not between a person and a placeholder. Winter in Paga was quiet and beautiful. Most of the tourists disappeared, leaving just the locals and the handful of us who decided to stay long-term. The village became smaller, more intimate. We celebrated holidays together. Greek holidays I'd never heard of and American ones I taught them about. I hosted Thanksgiving dinner at the guest house, trying to explain the historical nightmare of it while also celebrating the principle of gratitude. We ate and drank and laughed until late into the night, and when I went to bed, I felt full in a way that had nothing to do with food. I started a new series of paintings that winter, portraits of the people who'd welcomed me here. Eleni with her wise eyes and strong hands. Sophia laughing at her own jokes. Thomas deep in thought over his morning coffee. Dimitri with his apron covered in flour. Ava with her students gathered around her. The old women with their beans. The fishermen mending nets. The face of this community that had saved me without even trying. One night in late February, I was having dinner with Eleni and Sophia when Sophia asked me if I ever regretted staying. If I ever wished I'd just gone back to the States and tried to repair things with Melanie on familiar ground. I thought about it honestly before answering. No, I said finally. Because if I'd gone back, I would have been going back to being the person they needed me to be instead of the person I actually am. This way, if Melanie and I rebuild our relationship, it'll be real. It'll be based on who we actually are, not who we're pretending to be for each other. And if you can't rebuild it? Eleni asked gently. Then at least I'll have this, I said, gesturing around us. At the table full of food, at the warmth of the small restaurant, at the village beyond the windows, at the life I'd built from nothing. At least I'll have found out who I am when I'm not busy being who everyone else needs. The night before Melanie was supposed to arrive in April, I couldn't sleep. I walked down to the beach and sat on the sand, listening to the waves and thinking about everything that had happened since that day in France. How much had changed. How much I'd changed. How terrifying it had been to walk away from the only identity I'd ever known. Mother, wife, caretaker, and discover that there was still someone underneath all those roles. Someone whole and real and worth knowing. I thought about Brad's face when he told me I was on my own, like it was a threat. Like being alone was the worst thing that could happen to a woman my age. But he'd been wrong. Being alone had been exactly what I needed. It had given me space to remember myself, to rebuild from the foundation up, to figure out what I actually wanted instead of constantly negotiating everyone else's needs. The moon was bright over the water, turning everything silver and black. I sat there until dawn started breaking, watched the sky change colors, watched the fishing boats head out for the day. This was my life now. These rhythms. This place. These people. And whatever happened with Melanie, whether we managed to build something new or whether we'd broken things too badly to repair, this would still be here. I would still be here. When Melanie stepped off the bus the next afternoon, I almost didn't recognize her. She'd cut her hair short. Lost weight. Had circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard decisions. But she was alone. No Brad hovering behind her, controlling the narrative, telling her what to think and feel. We hugged carefully, like strangers learning each other's shapes. Then I took her suitcase and said, "Come on. I want to show you something." I walked her through the village, pointing out landmarks. The bakery where Dimitri made that bread she'd loved as a child. The cafe where I'd met Eleni. The guest house where I taught workshops. The gallery with my paintings in the window. My apartment with its view of the water and the easel always set up by the window waiting. She was quiet through all of it, just looking. Taking it in. When we got to my balcony, she stood at the railing for a long time, staring at the sea. "It's beautiful here," she finally said. "It is," I agreed. "I understand why you stayed." Her voice cracked slightly. "I understand why you didn't come back." We stood there in silence for a while, and then she started talking. Told me about the months after Greece. How Brad had been furious that I didn't return with them, had blamed her for it, had used it as ammunition in every argument. How she'd started seeing a therapist, something he'd always mocked her for considering, and how the therapist had helped her see patterns she'd been blind to. How she'd started setting boundaries. Small ones at first, then bigger. How Brad had responded by trying harder to control her, which had only made the patterns more obvious. "I left him," she said abruptly. 2 months ago. I'm staying with a friend in Denver while the divorce goes through." I reached over and took her hand. "How are you doing?" "Terrified," she admitted. "Lost. I don't know who I am without him. I know that sounds crazy. I'm 42 years old, I should know who I am, but I don't. I got married so young, and then he became the person who told me what to think about everything, and now I don't have that and I don't know." She trailed off, and I squeezed her hand. "I know," I said quietly. "I know exactly how that feels." We looked at each other then, really looked, and something passed between us. Recognition. Understanding. The knowledge that we were both standing in the same space, that terrifying, liberating gap between who you were told to be and who you might actually become. "That day in France," she said, voice breaking. "Mom, I am so sorry. I don't know how to tell you how sorry I am. I chose him over you, and it was wrong, and I've hated myself for it every single day since." "I know," I said. "I forgive you." And I did. Not because what she'd done was okay, but because I understood now that she'd been just as trapped as I had been. Different trap, same basic mechanism. Making yourself small, silencing your own voice, believing that love required self-erasure. We spent the next 2 weeks carefully, gently learning each other again. I introduced her to my friends, and she fit in surprisingly well. Sophia took to her immediately, declaring that she had good energy now that the terrible husband is gone. Eleni taught her some basic Greek phrases and told her stories about her own divorce, how hard it was and how necessary. Thomas talked to her about architecture and philosophy and the importance of building a life that reflects who you actually are instead of who you think you should be. Melanie sat in on one of my watercolor workshops and was terrible at painting but laughed at herself instead of getting frustrated, which felt like progress. She helped at the guest house, made beds alongside me, served breakfast to tourists, listened to their stories. One night, she told me she was thinking about going back to school, finishing the degree she'd abandoned when she got married. Maybe social work. Maybe counseling. Maybe helping other women who'd lost themselves in bad relationships. I think that's a wonderful idea, I told her. On her last night, we sat on my balcony with wine and watched the sunset. The sky was doing that thing it does sometimes. Turning colors that don't seem possible, pinks and purples and golds all layered together like a painting someone made up. Will you come home? She asked quietly. Not permanently. I understand this is your home now. But just to visit? I want you to see my new place. Want you to be part of my life again. I'll visit, I promised. But Melanie, you need to understand, I'm not the mother you grew up with anymore. I'm not going to drop everything to help you move or watch your pets or do any of the things I used to do where I made myself small so you could expand. I love you. I want to be in your life. But it has to be different now. I know, she said. I want it to be different. I want us to actually know each other, not just play these roles we've been assigned. I want. She paused, searching for words. I want what you have. This peace. This sense of self. I don't know how to get there, but I want it. You'll figure it out, I said. It takes time. And it's terrifying. But you'll figure it out. We sat there until the stars came out, talking about small things and big things and everything in between. And when I took her to the bus station the next morning, our goodbye hug was different from the careful one when she'd arrived. It was tighter. More real. The hug of two people who were actually seeing each other instead of just going through the motions. After she left, I walked back through the village feeling both sad and peaceful. Sad because our relationship had been broken and was still being rebuilt, because you can't undo years of damage in 2 weeks. But peaceful because we were trying. Because we were both choosing to show up as our real selves instead of the versions we thought the other person needed. That afternoon, Eleni found me painting on my balcony. She didn't say anything, just sat down with her coffee and watched me work for a while. Your daughter is good, she finally said. Hurt, but good. She'll be okay. I think so too, I said. And you? Are you okay? I thought about the question. Really thought about it. Was I okay? My marriage was long over, ended by death, but broken long before that. My relationship with my daughter was still being rebuilt, still fragile and uncertain. I was living in a foreign country where I barely spoke the language, surviving on painting sales and teaching workshops, no retirement plan or safety net or any of the things you're supposed to have at 63. But I was painting every day. I had friends who loved me for who I actually was. I woke up every morning to beauty that took my breath away. I was learning new things, challenging myself, growing in ways I hadn't grown in decades. I was, for the first time in longer than I could remember, genuinely happy. Yes, I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. I'm okay. Better than okay. Eleni smiled. Good. You've earned it. She was right. I had earned it. Not through suffering or sacrifice or making myself smaller, but by finally choosing myself. By walking away from that train station in France and not looking back. By building something new from nothing. By believing I deserved more than I'd been given and being brave enough to reach for it. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, thank you. Thank you for listening to an old woman talk about the best decision she ever made. Because that's what it was, the best decision. Not leaving my daughter behind, but leaving behind the version of myself that was slowly suffocating under the weight of everyone else's expectations. I still live in Paga. Still paint. Still teach. Still wake up grateful for every single day of this impossible, beautiful life I built. Melanie visits twice a year now, and we're building something real, messy and complicated and true. She's figuring out who she is, just like I figured out who I am. We're both works in progress, and that's okay. Sometimes I think about that day in France, about standing on that platform watching their car disappear into the fog. About how scared I could have been, how lost I could have felt. About how easily I could have called them begging for rescue, could have apologized my way back into their good graces, could have made myself small enough to fit back into the box they'd built for me. But I didn't. I chose myself instead. And that choice led me here, to this balcony, this view, this life, this version of myself I like so much better than the one I used to be. They thought abandoning me would break me. Thought I'd come crawling back within the hour, helpless and apologetic. But what they didn't understand was that sometimes being left behind is exactly the push you need to finally move forward. I never called. Never begged. Never apologized for existing or for wanting more than they thought I deserved. I just walked away and built something beautiful with my own 2 hands. And you know what? That's the best revenge I could have ever asked for. Not hurting them back. Not making them suffer the way they made me suffer. Just living well. Living fully. Living as myself. Because in the end, the opposite of abandonment isn't rescue, it's self-discovery. And I discovered I was so much more than anyone ever gave me credit for. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world, dealing with your own abandonment, your own betrayal, your own moment of having to choose between who you've always been and who you might become, I want you to know something. You're stronger than you think. Braver than you know. More capable than anyone has ever told you. Choose yourself. Walk away if you need to. Build something new from the rubble of what broke. It's terrifying and lonely and hard, but I promise you it's worth it. You're worth it. Thank you for being here with me through this story. If it resonated with you, please check the description box below for more stories like this. Stories about finding yourself, reclaiming your life, and discovering that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to stay broken. Subscribe if you haven't already, because I think we all need reminders that it's never too late to start over. That being 63 or 70 or any age doesn't mean you're done growing and changing and becoming. That abandonment can be the beginning of something beautiful if you're brave enough to see it through. I'm going to go paint now. The light is perfect, and I have a canvas waiting, and this life, this impossible, beautiful, hard-won life, is calling me forward. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, you're never too old to choose yourself.